A woman in her 30s stood up in a crowded room and asked an author for advice because she felt like she was simply waiting to die because she was single and child-free. And I found this really interesting because the author did her best, if I'm being fair, to answer the question, but she herself had always dated from a very young age and had been in a long-term relationship since her early 20s and now was a mother to 3, and she's now in her late 30s. And I found it very interesting because, like I said, she did her best to answer. But what struck me was that because it's not an experience that she has lived in terms of being single as an adult and single and getting older as an adult, she could only really give platitudes and kind of these kind of, love yourself, find hobbies kind of answer. And as somebody who was watching on, I didn't think that was satisfactory. But it struck me that this woman who stood up and asked that question, she's not terminally ill. She didn't lack purpose. She had a career that she loved. She didn't lack friends because she said she had friends. But she wasn't married and she wasn't a mother. Now, before we get into this, I know we always have some obtuse people in the comments. One thing that we're not discussing here is whether or not it is okay to desire partnership, to desire marriage as a heterosexual woman in particular, quite frankly. That's not the discussion here. What we're talking about is the way singleness is often presented and the fact that women's lives have been valued on the basis of whether or not a man desires them and then goes on to choose them for long-term partnership. But let's be honest, marriage is usually the threshold of respectability, legibility, of value. And I know this. I grew up in a religion whereby there was only one type of relationship between a man and a woman that was legitimate and recognized, and that was marriage. And so if you were not married as a woman, and it may have changed now, I've been gone for 5 odd years, but I know when I was growing up, it was always a major source of conversation. A lot of the sisters, that was what would make up a lot of conversation for social situations. Now, of course, some of that is that because when you're very young, you're in your teens and early 20s, that's what young girls of all I suppose cultures and communities may speak about. But actually there was a real deep sense for women who were single, who did not want to be single, that they felt undesirable. They felt unchosen, essentially. Okay. And some deal with it in different ways. But because that was the only type of relationship that was recognized between men and women, there aren't any alternatives, as it were. And it's a religion whereby dating is not encouraged. You either court with a view to marriage and get married or do nothing. In addition to that, when I was growing up, and like I said, I've been out 5 years, I'm an adult woman now. But when I was younger, certainly, there were all sorts of rules around friendships even between members of the opposite sex. And so you would socialize in groups for the most part. And this is not unique to that religion. There are many other religions that promote and require the same kind of thing, culturally speaking. But one of the things that can happen, I observed in that religion, is that a lot of women and men, but I can only speak for women because that's who my main peer group was made up of, felt deep loneliness. And also, I think touch deprivation is a real thing, especially if you are in communities and religions where there is very little tactile behavior allowed. And I'm not just talking about between men and women particularly, right? But also, let's be an adult. The kind of touch, whether it's hugging, hand holding, bodies being near each other for warmth and presence, that adults may need and thrive from. I mean, for goodness sake, when babies are born, skin to skin contact is encouraged for a reason, okay? For their immune and nervous system development. It's just a survival thing. And as we get older as adults, of course, that happens less and less and less. In fact, unfortunately for a lot of women, if they do want contact or desire contact, like body contact or some level of intimacy that is non-sexual when it comes to men, that can be very difficult because a lot of the time, it's often seen as an invitation or the beginning of sexual contact. I've seen too many videos to count on social media apps where women are talking about their experiences when it comes to maybe only wanting a hug or to hold hands, but the expectation from their male partner or the man in their company was that it was going to be much more. And so there does seem to be a mismatch often between men and women around being able to be physically tactile, affectionate without it leading to sex. And there's a whole host of conversation we can have around that and how that often leads into other things like, rape culture and this idea that women are inviting all sexual contact if they allow non-sexual contact or contact of any kind with a man. But my point is this: a lot of the women who I had conversations with, observed, socialized with, knew, it was a deeper kind of grief sometimes and sorrow and depression around being single, that it wasn't entirely down to the fact that they weren't married. It was actually, life can be very solitary when you're single in a lot of these communities, right? There's a difference, I think, that we often miss. Singleness is just a relationship status, but of course it comes with a lot of social connotations. And for women, a lot of things around self-worth, value, desire, etc., and status as well. But I recognize that a lot of the women, because of the culture in that community, I mean, you couldn't even sit in a car alone with a man, and nothing may be happening. You may not be attracted to that man. You just could not be alone with a member of the opposite sex ever. And like I say, whatever your beliefs around that are, because I know people have very strong beliefs about that, and in terms of, protecting purity, appropriate behavior, avoiding temptation, all of the things. My point is that singleness can often be solitary. Okay, and that can be quite challenging in reality. And when you add in those other elements of not being able to have just normal, I don't know what the word is, platonic, innocent companionship, right? It can definitely deepen, I think, the solitary element of being single. And touch deprivation is real. When I talk about touch deprivation, a lot of the time people assume I'm talking about sex, and I am not. Sometimes that's about physical presence, warmth, all of those things, right? It doesn't always have to be sexual. And so I found it really interesting because she was, upon reflection, quite brave to stand up and ask that question. And I know we live in a world now where singleness, particularly within the context of the male loneliness epidemic, declining birth rates, the numbers of single women now, especially in the US and the UK, it's a much more mainstream conversation. Okay, it's happening in the secular space as well as now in religious spaces, where before you may have been led to believe that because there's a smaller pool of Christians, a smaller pool of members of a particular denomination, that's why it was difficult maybe for women to find mates. And so it was quite brave of that woman to stand up at that event and ask that question. But like I say, overall, I thought the answer was quite unsatisfactory, because a lot of the time, women are asking women who haven't actually lived that life. And recently, I think it was over on X, and then it came on to Substack, there was a married woman who kind of made this declaration that she supports single and child-free women. And there were a number of women under who were saying it's so good to see a married woman say this. And I think there's something really important here. And I do not mean this to be trite, but you do not need the approval or validation or the sign-off from anybody else, quite frankly, whether it's men, misogynistic men, married women, married men, to legitimize your decision to be single. If singleness is a choice for you, you simply don't need other people to understand or accept it. I can't tell you the number of times, especially in my old religion, people say, it'd be one of two camps with me because I've always been like this. So it'll be, you'll change your mind. And I'm like, yeah, I've never met a married woman that I'd swap lives with, ever. Never, ever. And then the other one would be, it would take a special kind of man to be with you. And I always used to chuckle with that because they say you need to be a very strong kind of man. And I always find that interesting because actually what people don't realize is that kindness in men goes a long way. You know, when a man is genuinely and sincerely kind as a part of his character, it's a beautiful thing because it's not actually very common. But it's a beautiful thing when there is kindness in a man. And so I used to chuckle because it always told me that people didn't understand me at all. Because what they were essentially always telling me was that you need someone who can dominate you, which is in fact the opposite of what I'd ever invite into my life. And then the other thing would be, well, you're going to be single because of the way you are. Now, my point here is this, that when you're single by choice, I think what people don't realize is that you don't need them to support your choice, that you don't need other people to recognize you're a whole individual who has the adult authority to make a decision for yourself. You also do not need to convince other people that you are happy. That's a big one. I can't tell you the number of times men will be in the comments in my DMs saying there's no way you can be happy, which always tells me, first of all, how small their world is and how small their self-perception is. Because if your happiness in life is wrapped up in being chosen by somebody else, particularly a man, and I have to be honest here, the value of a man's attraction is very low. A man being sexually attracted to you, it doesn't hold a lot of water because all it is sexual attraction. All it is sexual desire. All it is a desire to access your body. It doesn't mean much else, right? Because a man being attracted to you does not guarantee, and it's not the same thing as a genuine intention to respect you, to cherish you, to honor you, or to respect you. And I've always known the difference. And when you look around you in the world that we live in today, human nature is human nature. And so actually someone merely being attracted to you, I mean, what's that really worth in reality? Because if you are looking for a partner anyway, is hopefully them actually genuinely respecting you and that being borne out through their actions, their words in private and in public. And so, look, really and truly, your life does not begin when a man chooses you. Now, I know some people find this conversation very difficult because in their world, they have been raised and conditioned to believe that marriage is actually the highest thing that a woman can do. It's an achievement. It's a milestone. I always find it funny when we say milestone. It's not a milestone. It's a life event. That's what it is. It's just something that can happen in life. It's not a milestone. Because what does that suggest for the women who do want marriage and never experience it? Is that a milestone that they've missed? No, of course not. Now, as to whether or not it's an achievement, I know a lot of people who are married, especially when they're religious, because obviously they all believe that marriage is under attack, the devil is coming after marriage, when in actual fact, it's married people who make things difficult for themselves, number one. And number two, married people, because of the way they conduct themselves, it's not great PR and marketing for marriage for those who are unmarried. I always find it very funny that they start saying things like, marriage is under spiritual attack, when in actual fact, all we're doing is watching how you married people are treating each other. The other day I saw a married man say that no one talks about the devastation that a man experiences when he cheats on his wife. What kind of gaslighting nonsense is that? Right? You can literally have people cheating on each other. Remember, everyone has the capacity to cheat. Women and men cheat, okay? But what I do find audacious is when men, what do you mean devastation? You've had your cake, you've eaten it, your belly is full, you enjoyed another woman repeatedly, premeditated, you were dishonest, disloyal, deceitful, disrespectful, you betrayed your vows, you've humiliated your wife, and you want her to have grace for the devastation you're experiencing now that you've been caught. Because 9 times out of 10, they're not confessing. And so my thing is, married people don't do a very good job of PR and marketing. And I see this other thing about how the happy married couples just don't share their marriages online, and that's why marriage looks so bad. Look, Like I said, I've never met a married couple. I think I'd swap my life, the one I've got now, with yours. I know one married couple, they're genuinely friends and they're a lovely couple, to be honest. But I still wouldn't swap my single life and freedom, right? And so the point I'm making here is that ultimately your life doesn't begin when you get married. You know, we're living in times now where women can travel, they can have their own money, they can do their own things. And again, when I was growing up, there were literally women who were like, I'm not going to Barbados because that's something I'll do with my husband. I'm not going to buy a property because that's something I'll do with my husband. And they wasted their lives. And for the ones who didn't get married, and there are generations in that religion who marriage did not happen for them, it can be really disappointing and soul crushing. And there's a sense of grief. Your life is not on hold because you're single, even if you still desire a partner. There is an entire life, a glorious life you can live. Now, yes, it's true, and I've talked about loneliness in another video, and the nuances when it comes to loneliness, right? There's all different types of loneliness, but loneliness visits every single human being. There are people in marriages and relationships who are lonely. There are parents who feel lonely. So it's not a case of if you will ever be lonely in the future, it's when. And so really what we have to do often as single people is be more proactive around how we navigate loneliness. It does mean that we have to be proactive in contributing to and maintaining friendships and community. It's not something that will just happen. And then naturally, as people age, people do sometimes become less social anyway. And this is regardless of marital status. And so there is a piece as you age around having to continue to be proactive in participating and having healthy human connection. The first time I sat in a car with a man, that there was nothing happening, but he was dropping me home. And I recognized, because obviously in my old religion, that would have been a no-no. And if I'd been seen, the elders would have come and had a little chat with me in the second school about how wrong that was. And there I was at 35, I think I was, sitting in the car with a man that wasn't a cab driver, because I wouldn't have sat in the front. Usually in an Uber, I sit in the back, you know. And so sitting in a car with a man that I do know, who nothing was happening with, but we're both in the car alone, having a chat while he drops me home. Bizarre, right? But actually, that was a completely innocent interaction that was human, like, interaction. That's what it was. And so I noticed how different and new that was. And I was an adult, well into my adult years. But you have to be more proactive. Unfortunately, fortunately, it's just a reality of life. And I'm not going to give you platitudes like, you know, get a hobby or work on yourself, because I think sometimes those things quite simply aren't helpful and they don't make you feel any better, quite frankly, if you are not single by choice, or even if you are single by choice, but it's ebbing and flowing in terms of how you feel within yourself. But your current life is valid and valuable. Okay. But this is also a reason why I do believe that we should be celebrating life more often. You know, whenever I travel, or it's usually when I travel or I go somewhere really nice, and you know, they will ask you, the maitre d' will often ask you, are you celebrating something? I've always said I'm celebrating life. Always. And I mean that deeply and truly from within. Given, of course, I didn't grow up celebrating birthdays or Christmases or any of those kind of celebrations. Funny enough, all of the celebrations that are about the individual are forbidden. Sometimes I chuckle at that. And so I don't have any neurological pathways and any memories on a brain level around birthdays, Christmases, things like that. And so I don't celebrate them really now because I'm not inclined to do so. I don't have any attachment to them. And so my entire life has been about experiencing life, regardless of whether or not it is a national holiday or some kind of age-related milestone. And so I always say I'm celebrating life, and I mean it fully and genuinely. It's not a consolation prize for me. And so I think it's very important, because ultimately, nearly all of the achievements and milestones that are associated with women are attached to men. Okay? Engagement parties, bridal showers, hen do's, baby showers, gender reveals, anniversaries, christenings. In some way, there's a man in the mix. A man or his sperm, a man's selection, a man's presence, or the whiff of a man, okay, is related to these celebrations. And I think one of the things that I do think women in particular could be better at is celebrating their friends outside of these instances. Because if you have single friends who are single by choice or single by circumstance, you won't have a socially recognized reason to celebrate them in the ways that women who do partner with men are celebrated. And so things like first home purchases or moving into a new place, promotions, debt-free milestones, if they start a business, if they move country, if they publish a book, if they are gardening and that's their thing, right? It can be anything. It doesn't have to be big things. It can be smaller things that mean something to her. And I do think actually we need to be better about celebrating and recognizing other events that happen in life more generally. Okay, because a lot of the time single women are celebrating things alone or privately because they're not getting engaged and they're not getting married and then maybe not even having a baby, for example. And so there isn't asymmetry there in terms of the investment and attention. And that includes financial investment, emotional investment, time investment that we put into things like weddings and baby showers, the money, the gifts, the travel that we do. Childcare support, emotional labor that we extend to women who are engaging in these socially rewarded structures that involve men. Okay. And so we do need to do better with that, I think, with each other and not make excuses, because I see a lot of the times there are nothing but excuses in the comments. And quite frankly, the amount of times I've seen women say, it must be just your friends, you've got bad friends. This is actually a common phenomenon. Actually, yesterday I saw a podcast. It was the She's So Lucky podcast, and it was an episode where there's a journalist, I think she's written a book about how weddings ruin friendships, female friendships specifically. And this is the thing. Sometimes we're not always very honest about the reality of some of these things. And she has documented very well some of the common reasons why friendships are destroyed when a woman gets engaged and gets married. And a lot of the time it's presented online as if the single friends are jealous. Like I said, when you think about the level of investment that goes into those occasions, money, travel, time, gifts, etc., and the expectations that women often have of their bridesmaids, the maid of honor, expectations, by the way, they don't have of their husband, the man that they're marrying. They'll accept their husband smashing wedding cake into their face on the wedding day or pushing them into a pool. But if one of their friends doesn't hop, skip to the hen do, it's a problem. Okay, so we have to get more honest about these things in terms of the lack of support we do actually extend to friends who are single. And how the truth is, yes, marriage and motherhood can be very consuming. And there are obviously going to be responsibilities that come along with that. But actually, we need to make less excuses for the ways that we actually treat and show regard, show consideration for friends that we might have who are single, because it does matter. And these friendships should be reciprocal. They should be mutually fulfilling. Yes, they ebb and flow. We all go through life stages, but actually they should indeed be mutually reciprocal, right? And then the last thing I will say that should be obvious, but apparently it's not very obvious. Not every woman is waiting to be chosen. Not every woman wants to be in a marriage or relationship. There are genuinely women who are living content, peaceful lives alone. And it doesn't mean that there's a deficit, that there's lack, that she's undesirable. I mean, sometimes I get so bored because actually I'm convinced now that people are being obtuse deliberately at this point, because people cannot fathom a woman being in her full authority, knowing who she is and making an informed decision about whether or not she wants to partner with someone legally or even live with someone, much less share her body with someone. I always say, these things are like hospitality. All right, you get to invite who you want to invite into your home. You can also revoke the invitation, right? You do not have to extend hospitality to anybody else just because it's a societal expectation. And so singleness is not an unfinished version of womanhood. To marry and to become a mother is not the quintessential indicator of womanhood. There are other things that you can do that don't include marriage, that don't include motherhood, that are still valuable and valid and legitimate. So yes, that is a question I get quite often around, singleness, and how to navigate some of these realities of being single. Now, as you know, the Invisible Contract Foundation framework is completely free. It's somewhere in the description, but that can help you to identify and work through any invisible contracts that you think might be governing your life as related to marriage and motherhood.